Tonight on Bridge City News, 3 dead and 24 injured after a bus rollover in Alberta's Jasper National Park. The provincial government is providing up to $5 million to build a recovery community in Red Deer. And homeless people will find new ways to express themselves through a weekly art class at the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen.
Your nation, your province, your southern Alberta. From the heart of Lethbridge, it's Bridge City News Weekend Edition.
Good evening, I'm Loris Alexander. Thank you for joining us. We begin with a tragic story in Alberta. 3 people are dead after their sightseeing bus rolled over near the Columbia ice field. More than 20 others were injured as a result. No names are being released as next of kin notifications are underway. The provincial government is providing up to $5 million to build a recovery community in Red Deer. Premier Jason Kenney made the announcement yesterday.
I am excited to announce that the first of these new treatment facilities, a 75-bed, fully equipped recovery community, will be built right here in Red Deer. Recovery communities, also known as therapeutic communities, offer long-term holistic treatment for people struggling with substance abuse, trauma, and mental health issues. This approach is being successfully used in 65 countries around the world, including as a central pillar of the internationally renowned Portuguese model. People who enter into recovery communities are given every opportunity and encouragement to take control of their addiction, to achieve sobriety, to improve their health, to reconnect with their loved ones. They rediscover personal responsibility and self-reliance, compassion for others injured by their actions, and the love of those who care for them. The recovery community experience is about far more than abstinence from drug use, although that is obviously essential. It's about confronting the realities of life, learning how to cope with them, and becoming a strong, fully functioning person. Participants advance through the stages of treatment at their own pace, assuming greater responsibility in the community along the way. But the goal is to leave the program not only drug-free, but also employed or going back to school. Recovery communities allow participants to heal.
The project will add 75 treatment beds in central Alberta in support of health, wellness, and long-term recovery. A new art program will bring purpose and income to the homeless in Lethbridge. Resilient Art YQL is an initiative put on by the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen, aiming to provide meaningful activity and opportunity for creative expression to the disadvantaged. The coordinator also shares how this will pay tribute to a friend she recently lost to a battle of addiction.
The first time I met Crystal was not the most positive experience. Unfortunately, my keys had gone missing and we found them on her. I was really heartbroken because I just saw this loving individual that was just so full of energy. Tuesday night, I was at the soup kitchen and Bill comes out and says, "Oh, this woman that had your keys, she wants to talk to you about your art program." So I'm starting this art program at the soup kitchen and she wanted to chat with me about it, and I was so excited because I knew it was the same woman. So I went out and I said, "Hey, I met you once, just so you know, past is in the past." And she says, "Can I give you a hug?" And I know COVID, but I wanted to give her a big hug. And so I gave her a hug and she said, "You think hugs are good?" And she picks me up like a little baby and starts spinning me around in a circle. I just kept thinking in another world she would be my friend and we would go for coffee. And then I thought, why can't that be our world? And why can't I get to know her on this level? Whether I meet people at the college or at the soup kitchen, they're just people that I can love and that I can learn from. And I wanted to share that love with her. And the fact that I got to a little bit was great. The fact that she is gone is really heartbreaking. We started a Facebook group called Resilient Art YQL. We're going to sell their art because they don't really have a place to store it. So we're going to sell it to people in the city and put the money back towards things they need. So say Kevin really needs a new backpack. That's just an example of a person. But say Kevin really needs a new backpack. We're going to make a little fund and try to get Kevin that new backpack with his artwork. So things that the individual needs so that they can have purpose, dignity, and meaning in their life and also fill those tangible needs.
Art programming will run once a week at the Lethbridge Soup Kitchen, and sales will begin the first week of August. Domestic abuse of women has been in the public eye for many years, but as BCN's Naveen Day explains, the comparable issue of domestic abuse of men is not as well known, and in many times misunderstood by the public.
According to Stats Canada, men are abused in relationships a lot more than we think. A 2018 study shows that the amount of police-reported partner violence does not vary much by gender. However, Bill Kay, project manager with the Domestic Violence Action Team, says when it comes to overall numbers, men make up only 14% of the incidents.
Reporting by men has increased over the last 20, 25 years. We do believe it's underreported. There's a number of different things that cause that. Lack of some services for men, sometimes for as far as shelters and those sorts of things. And also just the stigma that goes with it. Women experience that same stigma, and men experience a stigma as well. Just it's a different stigma, that's all.
One such victim of domestic abuse says that he was attacked and strangled for 68 minutes.
I didn't know I would be the victim of domestic abuse. I'd never been strangled before. I want people to know, if you've ever had strangulation in your relationship, the stats are they will kill you. 2 weeks later, the attack was much more severe. I barely made it away with my life. The police then place charges, make an arrest. The perpetrator is put in jail for 24 hours, but then just released.
According to Cox, not every victim gets justice. He says prior to the start of the court trial, the accused died.
There is no happy ending to these situations. We're left with trauma, guilt, blame, victimization. Even if you do get your day in court, or you think justice, jail time, or mandated mental health intervention is put in, it might not ever feel like enough. So it's really important you take care of your own mental health, and that's how you're truly going to survive this.
For Bridge City News, I'm Naveen Day.
Great news for kids and parents as the Henderson Pool, complete with water slides, reopens today. Guests will be asked questions when they enter the facility and will also have to fill out a COVID-19 questionnaire before they are allowed inside. Animal experts are issuing a warning as the weather gets hotter to never leave your pet in your vehicle, even when the windows open slightly. Experts say the temperature in a car can be fatal to a pet as it soars within minutes.
Leave them at home. You know, it's cool there, they've got water, there's shade, it's a familiar place, and they're happier at home for sure. Even though it's easy to say, you know, they just love to come for the ride. I do that too. But the problem with leaving dogs in the car, even for 5 minutes, you say you run in so quick, is that dogs really can't exchange heat as well as people can. They can't sweat, and they really overheat much quicker than we expect them to, especially the ones that have the short noses, the brachycephalic breeds. They can't exchange air as well or as efficiently. And then the ones that have really thick coats, like the northern breeds, huskies and malamutes and those sorts of things, struggle extra as well. So that's the first reason they have trouble exchanging heat and cooling themselves down. And then the last reason is cars are greenhouses, really. The windows combine with sun, and even if it's a cloudy day or you park in the shade, the UV rays and the hot summer air just combines to heat it up like a greenhouse. It can reach 50 or 60 degrees Celsius in just minutes.
Recapping one of our top news stories. 3 people are dead after their sightseeing bus rolled over near the Columbia ice field. More than 20 others were injured as a result. No names are being released as next of kin notifications are underway. And a look at weekend weather. Tonight, partly cloudy with a risk of a thunderstorm in the evening, becoming partly cloudy with a chance of a shower overnight and a low of 12. Tomorrow, mainly sunny with a high of 24. Hundreds of thousands of people have taken to the streets to protest against police brutality after the death of George Floyd in Minneapolis. His last words, "I can't breathe," have become a rallying cry to end systemic racism, not just in policing, but also in other sectors of society. BCN's Hal Roberts explores that topic with Dr. Edna Jakota Assam. That interview is up next.
After the killing of George Floyd, a black man who was murdered by a white police officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota, the Black Lives Matter movement has turned up the heat to address racism in the United States. The world seemed to take up the cause and began protests of their own. Canadians also began looking at themselves in the mirror, wondering if we too have racist issues in our own country. Joining me now to talk about this very important issue is Dr. Edna Jokoro Assem, a sociologist with Athabasca University here in Lethbridge. Dr. Assem, welcome to BCN.
I am happy to be with you, Hal.
That's wonderful. Do you mind if I call you Edna? Is that okay?
That's fine. You can call me Edna.
Thank you, Edna. Now, people across the world see Canada as a country that accepts a lot of cultures. But is it really? What are your thoughts about racism here in our country, Canada?
Racism, the word is actually very tricky in the sense that the way that people define it can influence how they perceive and explain it. So I realized that since the George Floyd incidents, there have been terms that have been thrown around like systemic racism and institutional racism, and people don't quite know, I think, what they mean. And I think that has influenced the way people have been talking about race and race relations in Canada. So I think when we say racism is systemic, it actually means that it's something that is unconscious. It's not something that is done on purpose. So from that angle, you can say that there are elements of it in Canadian society in the sense that you don't really see it. People don't intend to be racist, but then they are racist in their consequences. So the effect on people is racist, but then the people who are intending that act may not think that it's racist or it's conscious.
So, Edna, what country did you come from originally?
Originally from Ghana in West Africa.
Oh, Ghana. Okay, wonderful. So when you came to Canada, did you yourself experience racism?
Yes, I did. Actually, I did on several occasions, and I continue to do, but it's just my reaction to it that is completely different now than then because I felt it's not in your face, it's more subtle about the way people go about it. And I think in most cases, people are actually not conscious about it. I mean, there are instances where you know it's racial profiling. For example, if you walk into the grocery store and the security guard follows you around, which has happened to me several times, but you just take it in strides and walk away. If you want to confront, you can, but I tend not to want to confront. So sometimes I turn it into a game. But initially, it bothered me. And I actually remember an incident in Edmonton where I literally ran out of the store and I was hyperventilating. Like I was so upset. And I thought, am I going to die because of someone's ignorance? I'm not going to. Just think about it. So I made a decision that when I encounter such challenges, if I want to confront the people, I'll confront them. If I don't want to, I'll just let it go. So that is how I have dealt with it.
Now, some would say here in Western Canada as well, Edna, that racism may also lean a little bit towards Indigenous or First Nations peoples. What are your thoughts?
I think so. And this in the past was institutionalized in the sense that they were in residential schools. But now is systemic in the sense that in most cases you think it's unconscious. It's not something that is deliberate, but is deliberate in the consequences. So for example, if First Nations people have a very high rate of incarceration in our prison system. Meanwhile, they are a very small fraction of our population. So that is one way you can determine that there's something going on. So the reason is, why do they have high rate of incarceration? So then you have to begin to investigate. Is it because they are involved in all these crimes? And that is not to say there are no other crimes, but it just means that they are more likely to be prosecuted than other so-called white-collar crimes that are more difficult to prosecute.
So what can we do as a country then as we work towards reconciliation with our First Nations peoples?
I think the first part is actually recognizing the problem, and I think there's that recognition, but it's the next step that is a challenge, because I think that there has to be engagement and we have to be able to engage, and I don't think that people are ready to engage, because when you try to engage, sometimes you don't know the words to use. And if you use the wrong word, you could get into trouble. So I think that makes people hesitant to be able to engage and discuss some of these issues.
Edna, I've spoken to some Black community leaders here who are not fans of the group Black Lives Matter, saying BLM has an agenda that does not align with their own beliefs. How do you respond to that?
I think that we have to make a distinction between the organization and the phrase, because when you say Black Lives Matter, the organization, obviously they have things that they stand for that some people are uncomfortable with. But when you use the phrase Black Lives Matter, there are lots of people that support that because they think that, when you look at the racial injustice, especially George Floyd and others who have experienced such just inhumane treatment, they want to be supportive of that, but they are not necessarily supportive of the organization. So I think it's important to be able to make that distinction, to say, even if you do not support the organization, you support the phrase, the idea, the concept that, all humans are created equal and they require some form of justice in our society.
Amen. I like how you separated the phrase from the actual group itself. If you don't really agree with their ideologies, right? We all believe that, yes, Black Lives Matter, you bet. It's important to take a good, close, hard look at ourselves and our actions, but should companies like Aunt Jemima and Uncle Ben's be changing their brands to follow a trend right now?
That's a good question. I think when you look at Aunt Jemima, for example, you look at the history of it. Obviously, there are racist undertones, but over the years, they've tried and worked very hard to reform that image. And it's actually interesting that you brought that up, because when they wanted to change their name, Aunt Jemima's relatives were not very happy. They felt they were not consulted. So it gets a little bit complicated when you begin to look at sort of the interpersonal level of some of these debates, because on sort of the macro level, you have all these movements, people calling for change. And then on the micro level, you have the family, the extended family saying, well, we know that this is the history, but we still want that connection. So I think there's a need for engagement to be able to figure out how we move forward, because definitely that the history is racist. So to move forward, we need to just engage with each other and decide and take it case by case. I think it's very, very important that, we listen to all sides and engage. That's very, very important. We have to engage.
I watched this video last week of this young Black man. He had Aunt Jemima pancakes, Aunt Jemima syrup. He's eating. He said, "This is what racism tastes like? I like it." Like, and it went viral, right? 2-3 million people watched it, and they're all like, "That's great." Now, how about professional sports teams like the Washington Redskins and the Cleveland Indians? How important is it for them, Edna, to change their team names?
If you think about the Redskins, of course, some people are very upset because they think it's cultural appropriation. But then there are two questions that you have to ask yourself. Who benefits from keeping the name? And then two, what discussion is going on to actually figure out what to do? Because you can easily jump on the bandwagon and say, okay, let's get rid of it. But on the other hand, is there a constructive dialogue going on with the different groups that are involved to figure out how to go forward? Because do we need to talk about this and think, okay, this is part of the history, but we don't need it now. What do we do with that name? Or do we try to find out just the different groups involved and figure out what to do? I know you asked about American teams, but I'm so tempted to talk about the Edmonton Eskimos because it's closer to home, right? And I think that when it comes to the Eskimos, it's a little bit more complicated, because I know media reports always talk about, oh, people want it changed. But then when you look at their situation, it's a bit more complicated in the sense that you have different groups involved. You have some leaders from the Inuit community who want to change, and then others who don't want to change. So what do you do as the owner of the team? Do you say, okay, who am I going to listen to? And I think this is where dialogue comes in. This is where engagement comes in, because obviously some people want to keep it and some people think it's cultural appropriation. So this is where engagement is very, very important.
Now, there are also calls for statues to be torn down and the names of schools changed, not just in the United States, but Canada as well. Can racism really be addressed without throwing out the baby with the bathwater?
I think this is where we need to deal with these issues on case-by-case basis and try to dialogue, because we don't want to completely say, okay, these people never existed, because God knows, we all make mistakes, right? But if it's associated with slavery, then the community has to come together and say, okay, you know what? This belongs to a museum. This statue belongs to a museum. We want it to be in the museum, not in the central part of the city where everyone walks in and sees this hero on a horse or whatever. But then we want this statue in a museum so we can have, an interpreter just trying to describe what you have, written information so that people can better understand why that statue exists. Because I think it's very, very important for us not to erase the past because it's inconsistent with today's values. I think it's very, very important, because if you erase that, then we would never know that there was this slave owner who existed. We will never know. So I personally believe that, yes, something should be done about those statues, but the community will have to decide whether it belongs in a museum. I don't want them to disappear completely, because people would never know what those people did. And I think it's very, very important that we know what they did in the past.
Some people say if you remove the statues and any memories of the history, you're bound to repeat it. So they're there for a reason. So moving forward, Edna, where do you think we should go as a society, especially here in Canada and in Alberta, when it comes to dealing with racism?
I think we can do several things, but I'll just talk about two. The first one, I think, is engagement. I think engagement is very, very important, especially because racism as we see today is systemic in the sense that it's unconscious and it's unintentional. So, for example, in Ontario this week, they decided that they were going to stop streaming grade 9 students. Now, when that policy originally was implemented, I don't think they thought that it was going to have that consequence on people. So they figured it out years later that this is a problem, let's address it. So I think at the policy level, anytime there's a policy implemented, there has to be evaluation after a couple of years to try to figure out the impact of that particular policy on groups of people. And at the micro level, like among people, interpersonal relationships, you can easily misunderstand someone's actions and term it racist, especially if it's systemic, because it's unconscious. They are not really thinking about it. Let me give you an example. If I walk into a shop and then someone meets me and says, "Can I help you?" I really don't mind. But some of my Black friends feel very offended for two reasons. One is that it means they are incapable of looking for what they are looking for, or they see it as, oh, it means you are watching me, you are putting me on notice that I'm being watched. Now, it's just different interpretations of the same thing. So until we are able to have that dialogue to know that, oh, if I say that, it may offend someone. So I don't have to talk that way, or I can ask the person, do you think this is offensive to you? That dialogue on the interpersonal level, I think, is very, very important, because if we don't talk about the difficult issues, there's no way we are going to be able to move forward. I mean, if you want to talk about race and your white friend doesn't want to talk about race because they are afraid of being labeled racist, then it becomes a problem. The other thing that I want to add is that once it's not illegal. Like if you say something and it's not illegal, we shouldn't throw people under the bus. We have to give them the benefit of the doubt because we are all humans. We make mistakes. So you could say something and it's very unconscious. You didn't even think that it was going to offend someone. And then you say it, and then the person gets offended. Then you say, "Oh, I'm really sorry, but let's not call for the resignation of that public official because they didn't know." Like I said, it's systemic. It may be unconscious. It may not be on purpose. So let's give each other grace and say, you know what? You blew this one. You know, just apologize and let's move on. And once the people know that that particular phrase or their action is offensive, they are not going to repeat it. And let's get to know each other. Because sometimes people don't really know you and they prejudge you, and based on that, they have all these racial stereotypes. But once they get to know you, they realize that, oh, okay, our DNA is the same. Over 90%, we are all the same right underneath the skin. So it's just getting to know each other and working on the policy level as well.
You know, I'm reminded of a song when I was a kid. Red and yellow, black and white, they're all precious in his sight. Dr. Edna Jokoro Assem, a sociologist with Athabasca University, thanks so much for your time today.
My pleasure, Hal.
The environment has made many worldwide headlines. Joining me now to discuss the issue is Dr. Kelvin Beisner, national spokesperson for the Cornwall Alliance, a group made up of natural scientists, economists, and theologians. Dr. Beisner, welcome to the show. We are so happy to have you on today.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be on the program with you.
All right, and I should have mentioned to you, you're joining us from Memphis, Tennessee, correct?
Yes.
Okay, excellent. Now, since this is right up your alley, why don't you tell us, in your opinion, what makes a true environmentalist?
Well, I think a true environmentalist is simply somebody who thinks, I want to make my life the kind of life that leaves the earth a better place than when I entered it. We put it this way, that as Christians involved in this, we take very seriously the instruction from God to human beings in Genesis 1:28 that we are supposed to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it, or rule it. But we don't want that ruling, that dominion, to be abusive, to be exploitative. Rather, we want it to reflect the way that God rules his creation. And what we see in the earlier verses of Genesis 1 is that God makes everything out of nothing. He brings light out of darkness, order out of chaos, life out of non-life, great variety of life. He instructs all the different forms of life to be fruitful and highly fecund. This is the kind of thing that we should be doing ourselves. So we describe this godly sort of dominion as men and women created in God's image, working together to enhance the fruitfulness and the beauty and the safety of the earth to the glory of God and to the benefit of our neighbors.
Now, you have written a book called Creation Stewardship, Evaluating Competing Views, in which you mention in that book that it's dangerous to put people or celebrities on a pedestal, such as someone like Greta Thunberg. So why do you say that?
Well, frankly, we need to actually know a lot about what it is we talk about when we pretend to give other people advice. And too often, celebrities, whether it be someone as young as Greta Thunberg, who began speaking out on these things at age 16, or Hollywood celebrities, many of them really, frankly, have never learned in great depth about these issues. I've been studying these issues since the mid-1980s, so it's 35 years in this, and even so, there are parts of this where I would not seek to speak out as an expert. I realize the limits of my own knowledge. So what we need to do is to go to people who really have true expertise on these things. That's why I put together the Cornwall Alliance the way we did. We have just under 70 scholars in our network About a third are natural scientists, including some of the world's top climate scientists. About a third are economists and policy wonks, and about a third are theologians and philosophers. So we try to bring all of those different insights together to address highly complex problems. And if we don't bring the different disciplinary backgrounds together, we're likely to have rather narrow, superficial approaches to solving very difficult problems.
Now, you wrote an interesting piece on your blog with the headline, Global Average Temperature Plummets, Tropical Temperature Fall, third biggest on record. Were you trying to make a point there?
The point is not that that proves that global warming isn't real. No, it doesn't prove any such thing. The point instead is that what we get in the climate debates is that the advocates of the notion of catastrophic anthropogenic global warming, man-made global warming that is catastrophic, will point to every heat wave, every temporary uptick in temperature as evidence that global warming is not only real, but is potentially catastrophic, that it is overwhelmingly man-made, things of that sort. But they won't do the same with downticks in temperature. And so I'm just simply pointing out an inconsistency. If that brief downturn in global average temperature about 2 years ago was not evidence against, then a brief upturn is not evidence for. What we need to be doing is looking at very long-term data and looking for real trends rather than anomalies in the trends. And the long-term data do show us that, well, the Earth's average surface atmospheric temperature has risen by roughly a degree Celsius since about the middle of the 19th century. And I think that human emissions of carbon dioxide have contributed to that, but the notion that it's catastrophic, the notion that it is overwhelmingly human, man-made, those notions I think are not well established in the actual evidence.
Okay, so we need to be careful not to fall into misleading information, basically, is what you're saying, whether it comes to social media or headlines. So how can the average viewer know what headline to trust?
Well, the self-serving answer for me would be to say, come to cornwallalliance.org, cornwallalliance.org. But, really, the Apostle Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast what is good. So this is why when we post things on the Cornwall Alliance's website, we make sure that we have links to sources of outstanding scholarly work so that people are able to check the figures for themselves, check the data. That's part of what we're supposed to do as Christians. And that's really the heart of what it is to be scientific. The Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman said that the key to science is that when we have a hypothesis, a guess as to how something works in nature, we set up experiments to see whether what would happen if our guess were right really does happen. And if the observations that come from the experiment, whether in the laboratory or out in the real world, if the observations contradict the prediction, then our guess, our hypothesis, even our theory is wrong. And it doesn't matter how smart we are or how beautiful our guess was or anything else. If observation contradicts theory, then the theory is wrong. And we have to go back to the drawing board. And that's what we get essentially in terms of the claims of very rapid, potentially catastrophic global warming. Those claims are all based not on empirical observations, but on computer models of how the atmosphere responds to added CO2. And the models, on average, predict 2 to 3 times as much warming as actually observed over the relevant period. That means the models are wrong, and they really need correcting.
Well, so you mentioned CO2, and we were talking about headlines. So headlines tell us that CO2 emissions from fossil fuels is the main cause of global warming. But you disagree with this claim, right?
Well, I think it's actually theoretically possible that that's true. What I think is that the best empirical evidence indicates that it's probably not true. Notice I said probably. Probably. I think in many, many different scientific things, we're quite mistaken to speak with total confidence and assurance. I would be wrong to say, well, it's a settled matter that CO2 from fossil fuels is not the primary cause of warming. I also think it's wrong to say, well, the science is settled. CO2 is the primary cause from burning fossil fuels. Here's why I say what I do. It's precisely because the computer models of global climate predict 2 to 3 times as much warming as actually has been observed in response to the added CO2 in the atmosphere, that we know, therefore, that the models are wrong, that they are over-predicting the amount of influence that CO2 has on global average temperature. When we look back through the history of global temperatures, we see that there have been very similar periods of warming in the past, such as the Minoan warm period, the Roman warm period, the medieval warm period. We've also seen cooling periods in the past, and the interesting thing is that although there is a correlation between temperature and CO2 content in the atmosphere, the correlation is the opposite of what you would think it would be if CO2 were the control knob for temperature. That is, temperature changes first, CO2 changes later. And the reason for that is that as the ocean warms, it outgasses CO2. Ocean water contains CO2. The warmer it is, the less CO2 it keeps in mixture. The colder it is, the more CO2 it holds. So as the temperature changes first, the CO2 follows.
Wow, you are very much a scientist, I could tell. Now, I don't know how it is in the US. I know that our federal government here, and you're probably aware of this, but our federal government here is requiring that all provinces put a carbon tax into place. Do you think that this will produce any positive results?
No, I think it will not produce positive results. And the fundamental reason is this, that a carbon tax assumes that adding carbon dioxide, and by the way, it's very deceptive to speak of it as a carbon tax because carbon is an element, and in its solid form, it's a black nasty dust, and it can be a problem. Okay, carbon dioxide is not carbon; it is carbon plus 2 atoms of oxygen. It's an odorless, colorless gas that is non-toxic at concentrations 20 times what they are in our present atmosphere. And it is absolutely essential to life. Plants need it for photosynthesis. And the more of it there is, the better plants grow. So treating carbon dioxide as a pollutant is actually, I think, quite the opposite of what it really is. The more CO2 there is in the air, the better plants grow, and that means there's more food for everything that eats plants or eats something else that does eat plants. So the result is a huge increase in crop yields around the world. This has been studied in literally thousands of peer-reviewed studies showing that we have seen an increase in crop yields measured in terms of about $3.2 trillion of extra food from 1960 to 2012, and we can expect about another $9.8 trillion worth of food just because we've added CO2 to the atmosphere from 2012 to 2050. So you don't tax something that you want more of. You reward it instead. So no, a carbon tax would not be a good idea.
Oh, wow. Now, Dr. Beisner, you believe that the current global response to climate change actually could have some implications, especially for the poor, right?
I do. And that's simply because everything that we produce, we do it using energy. It takes energy to grow food, to process food, to transport food, to make clothing, to make shelter, to have communication. We're using energy right now in this Skype call. takes vast amounts of energy to lift and keep whole societies out of poverty. Now, the less expensive energy is, the more of it people can use. And in fact, historically, it has been access to abundant, affordable energy, primarily through fossil fuels, coal, petroleum, and natural gas, that has lifted and kept whole societies out of poverty. If we're going to fight allegedly catastrophic, allegedly overwhelmingly man-made global warming by pushing fossil fuels out of our energy mix, we're going to do two things. One, we're going to raise the cost of energy because the fossil fuels are the cheapest source aside from nuclear and hydro. They're much cheaper than wind and solar when you count everything into the price. But two, we're also going to make that energy less reliable. The wind isn't always blowing, the sun isn't always shining. And because of that, you don't have a steady input of energy into the electric grid. That means you have an unstable grid. The more unstable it is, the more you're going to have brownouts and blackouts, and those things kill.
Now, a lot of Western nations are phasing out coal. How much of a problem is coal to the environment?
Well, if you burn coal in a really sloppy way, coal burning can be a very big problem to the environment. But in all developed countries, we have adopted ways of burning coal to generate electricity that are extremely clean. And essentially, the only thing that comes out of the misnamed smokestacks of coal-fired generating plants in developed countries is water vapor. It's just simply steam from the turbines and the cooling towers. Nothing else comes out. So coal can be badly used, and sometimes it is in very poor countries. And yet the interesting thing that happens, and we see this through the history of our environments and of our economies as well, is that even while air pollution rises in the early stages of economic development, as countries begin to use coal and can't yet afford the very, very highly efficient ways of using it, even while the air pollution rises, life expectancy rises too. And what that means is that the benefits of all of the economic development, driven in part by the use of coal, outweigh the risks. And then as people get wealthy enough, they can afford to adopt the cleaner technologies of using coal, and then you get rid of the pollution, and at the same time you have the benefits of that economic development.
Dr. Beisner, we're out of time, but thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us and sharing your expertise with us.
Well, thank you very much, and your listeners can learn more at cornwallalliance.org.
As the dust settles and economies slowly reopen after months of COVID-19 restrictions, those in developing nations are still dealing with rising numbers of coronavirus cases. Compassion Canada is a charitable organization committed to helping children and their families in these developing nations to prosper and live in health during the crisis. Joining me now to talk about it is the President and CEO of Compassion Canada, Alison Alley. Welcome back to BCN, Alison.
Thank you, Hal. It's great to be with you again.
Alison, how has COVID-19 really impacted your group, Compassion Canada?
Yeah, well, Compassion works in 37 countries in low, middle, and high income economies and countries. And this pandemic has impacted every single location we work, right? There's a reason why we call it a virus that knows no borders. And so, not dissimilar to in Canada, government quarantines were put in place in every area we work. Our offices were closed and staff were sent to work from home overnight around the globe. And so our focus since then as global leaders has been how can we come together and adapt and respond to not just the changing needs of kids living in poverty, but the critical and increasing needs that they're facing.
So what hurdles specifically have children and families living in poverty really come up against?
Yeah, so for kids and families living in extreme poverty, everything about COVID-19 is magnified for them. The risk, the fear, the uncertainty, the life and death reality that they face. Because many of the families that we serve have no safety net, right? So their survival is on the line when something like a health or an economic crisis hits. Many of them are day laborers, which means if they're unable to go out and earn a daily wage, they're unable to put food on their table at night. But beyond that, experts are also talking about the cascading effects of this pandemic. We anticipate hunger may double by the end of the year. We see the pandemic triggering, an increase in preventable diseases like malaria and measles. And really, it could undo more than 10 years of progress towards combating poverty. And so, this is a crisis for the world's poor, unlike anything we've ever seen.
Allison, have staff members been able to visit the homes of the sponsored kids? And if so, what measures have they taken to really prevent the spread of COVID-19?
Yeah, our program has always been locally led and contextualized with a focus on knowing, loving, and protecting kids based on their unique needs and the unique challenges that they face. But in this season, as you can imagine, our staff and our partners are having to be more creative and adaptive than they've ever had to be in how they go about doing that. But they're getting in front of them. They're visiting their homes when they're able to do that. They're delivering food and hygiene kits. They're making mask and hand sanitizer, educating communities through flyers and digital campaigns. And of course, a critical part of our work right now is trauma counseling and child protection. Because when there's crisis in the home and when there's instability, kids are often the ones that are the most impacted as violence in the home increases. So we're working on that as well, of course.
Can you comment on the strain this crisis has had specifically on medical services in some of these developing countries?
Yeah, the countries that we work in, Hal, already have fragile and strained medical and health systems. So, as you can imagine, when you add COVID-19 to the picture, it becomes even more critical because they have to choose where to allocate their already limited resources. It's not dissimilar to what we saw during the Ebola epidemic when West African countries had no choice but to really devote their limited resources to battling the deadly disease. But it meant that other important life saving interventions like basic vaccinations or maternal health were neglected. And that basically led to a rise in maternal deaths. And so it is dire. It's staggering how under resourced they are and the implication of that. But actually, it's interesting timing because I was just on a call with our National Director of Compassion Ecuador right before talking to you, Hal. And he had talked about how, in addition to all the ways that they're helping kids and families access medical services or give them access to private hospital care if needed, they've also created a new telehealth program. And so they've created this phone number similar to telehealth that we would have that these kids and families can call to access a network of doctors and practitioners and counselors. But what I love about this is that some of those medical professionals are former sponsored children who have gone through our leadership development program and are now doctors and nurses. So incredible work's being done.
Wow, great success stories. Nice to hear that. Now, are cases of the virus, Allison, increasing or decreasing in some of these developing nations?
Yeah, the spread and the impact of the virus is certainly different everywhere that we work, but it is definitely continuing to increase. Developing countries now account for 3/4 of the new daily cases that are being reported. But of course, we know that with the limitations of testing in those contexts, the numbers are much, much higher. But it is increasing the fastest in Latin America right now, faster than anywhere in the world. We happen to work in Brazil, which, if you're following the news, that's now become one of the new epicenters of the pandemic, right? And they're anticipating that its numbers are going to surpass the United States in the coming weeks. For us, we've got our eye on the fact that it's spreading into the Northeast region, which is where most of the country's impoverished regions are. And it's also moving into indigenous territories in the Amazon, which, as you can imagine, we were just talking about limited medical care. That would be most certainly the case there.
So how about education? Are people able to get out to some of these regions, the far remote regions of the Amazon or maybe in Latin America, and explaining that, social distancing, physical distancing is important, not to spread the virus, the masks and so forth?
Yeah, I mean that's the challenge. It's education is always a struggle. First of all, in getting to the remote regions, as you said, but even those who have access to education, formal education, are no longer able to go. So for us as an organization, we have been working as it relates to just healthcare and prevention education to provide that in creative ways. We have different social media and digital campaigns. We've been putting flyers up in communities, but we also have been creating videos and FaceTime calls with students who have been preparing, for example, for end of year exams or for different schoolwork. We've ensured to get in front of them and support them in their more formal academic and educational needs as well.
Now, Compassion Canada also has this thing called We Rise as One initiative, helping out in some of these developing countries. Allison, let's chit-chat a bit about that.
Yeah, well, ultimately, we feel like a global crisis warrants a global response. And so our worldwide Compassion family has come together for the first time to launch a global fundraising campaign to help the most critically vulnerable children and families. And so we're inviting exactly that, folks around the globe to join us and to rise as one, to lift up their voice, to give their influence, but also to respond practically to those who so desperately need it. So, specifically, how we're raising funds to give at risk children, families, and communities the health and stability they need through hygiene, food, and shelter.
What is in some of these kits actually that has the food and hygiene?
Yeah, so for hygiene, it would include really practical things like hand sanitizer, soap, vitamins, supplements, cleaning supplies, protective masks, and of course, as we talked about education, the tools on how to use it and why it's important. But we also have these food kits that we're handing out. And it's probably worth noting that food security is becoming one of the most prominent and severe risks, not just for the people that we serve, but for those experiencing COVID-19 in these low-income economies. Because as I said, they're unable to make income, which makes them unable to provide food, but also how we're seeing already that global supply chains are starting to break down. When there's food shortages and shortage of supply, we know that the price goes up, which is just magnifying and intensifying the need for these families. So for us, we are providing practical kits that include things like rice and eggs and milk and corn and other non-perishables. While also a large part of our work is on helping pregnant and new moms. And so we ensure that these pregnant and nursing mothers have the nutrition and supplements that they need as well.
You know, they sound fairly helpful. Will Compassion continue to give out the kits after the coronavirus crisis?
Yeah, I mean, this is a short-term relief that we're doing as part of our long-term sustainable development efforts. And so we always focus on the holistic well-being of the kids that we serve. We work to grow them spiritually, socially, physically, and cognitively. And therefore, things like hygiene and food and stability are a regular part of what we do. But as we move forward and enter new phases of development, the way that we offer them and how we do it will continue to change based on their unique needs and the opportunities around them.
You know, Allison, even before we've ever heard of COVID-19, your organization was involved in something called holistic child development work. Tell me a bit more about that.
Yeah, so that recognizes that we as human beings are whole beings, and we can so often think of poverty as just an economic challenge that requires a financial response. But we, particularly as a faith-based organization, recognize that not dissimilar to how Jesus grew. It says in Luke 2:52 that Jesus grew in wisdom, in stature, in favor with God, and in favor with man. We follow that model and develop kids spiritually, socially, physically, and cognitively so they can really flourish into their full God-given potential and contribute wholly to the community around them.
Let's talk more specifically now about how Compassion Canada works. On your website, you say that we shouldn't respond to poverty by just handing out food and Bibles, correct?
Yeah, we really think that it's important, first of all, to have a long-term model that prioritizes and highlights the local, national people. And so I think the first thing to understand, and I will answer your question more directly, but the first thing is we work only with national offices and partner with local churches who have been there before Compassion, will be there after Compassion, and really know the names and the faces and the needs of their communities. And because of that, they understand that poverty is complex, development is complex, And not dissimilar to how we think about our needs, Hal, the needs of our kids, the needs of our society. They work to address all of those needs as well and say, yeah, there's a physical component, but there's also social, interpersonal, there's family needs, there's community needs. And so they work to grow kids holistically in that context in appropriate ways.
Now we pray that God would bless and support various nonprofits, including your own, which honor him and bring him glory. How can our viewers bless you? What are you specifically needing help with? Is it maybe volunteers?
Yeah, well, first of all, we appreciate your prayer. There's so much need, as you can imagine, and we are facing an incredible amount of cases in our beneficiaries and their families, and of course, are starting to encounter deaths of the kids that we serve or of our frontline partners and volunteers. So pray for them and the impact on their family. But specifically, absolutely, we're always looking for volunteers. And actually, we launched this We Rise as One campaign with our volunteers, which are really close family members of our organization, just last night. And so you can check out different volunteer opportunities on our website, which is compassion.ca.
Yes, for more information, definitely check out that website and continue with the great work around the world. Great job, Allison.
Thank you so much, Hal. Appreciate your time.
Allison Alley, President and CEO of Compassion Canada. On behalf of all of us here at PCN, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless, and thanks so much for watching.